The rain had been falling over the coastal town since noon, thin and cold, the kind that soaked through denim jackets and left the streets slick with reflected neon. Inside one of the city's finest restaurants, crystal glasses caught the low amber light, and the smell of butter and rosemary drifted from the kitchen into a dining room full of quiet, practiced elegance. A man sat alone near the window, dressed in a plain gray jacket that had seen better winters, his hands rough and scarred in a way that did not belong among the silk ties and diamond cufflinks around him. He had come for a simple dinner after a long day of work. Nothing more. Then came the sound of a glass shattering against the floor, sharp and sudden, followed by a woman's voice trying and failing to stay steady. Across the room, a wealthy man in an expensive suit had wrapped his hand around a waitress's wrist, pulling her down toward his table while his friends laughed. Nobody in that crowded restaurant moved to help her. The man in gray set down his fork, wiped his mouth once, and stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the marble floor like a warning. He did not know, not yet, that the trembling young woman he was about to defend was the only daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country. He only knew that something wrong was happening in front of him, and that he had never once in his life been able to sit still while someone smaller was being hurt by someone bigger. What happened in the next few minutes would humiliate a powerful man in front of everyone he wanted to impress. But the greater surprise was still waiting, hidden behind the choices a quiet waitress would make once the truth finally came out. Daniel Brooks was 42 years old, and there was a stillness in him that most people mistook for coldness until they got to know him better. He had spent 11 years as a United States Marine, 2 deployments overseas, and had come home with a body full of small scars and a mind that had learned the hard way when to speak and when silence served better. His wife had died 6 years earlier after a long illness, and since then Daniel had lived alone in a modest house near the edge of town, working as an independent handyman, fixing leaking pipes, faulty wiring, and broken door hinges for anyone who called. He never spoke about the war unless directly asked, and even then he offered only a few careful sentences before changing the subject. The people who hired him often said the same thing about him, that he was too generous for his own good, always finishing a job faster than he billed for it, always leaving a little extra work done without charging a cent more. His neighbors described him as the kind of man you could set your clock by. Up before sunrise, gone by 7, home by dark. Never raising his voice, never asking for help even when he clearly needed it. He rarely went out, and on the evenings when he allowed himself a proper meal instead of something reheated over the stove, he chose small, quiet places where nobody expected anything from him. There was a widow 2 houses down who swore Daniel had rebuilt her back porch for free after a storm tore half of it away, refusing payment and telling her the wood alone had cost him almost nothing. There was a single mother across town whose water heater he had replaced on a Sunday morning without being asked twice, simply because he overheard her mention it was broken while he was fixing something else entirely. Stories like these followed him quietly through the community, never boasted about, never repeated by the man himself, surfacing only when someone else happened to mention his name in passing. He kept a small toolbox in the back of an old pickup truck that had long since stopped looking presentable, and he wore the same 3 flannel shirts in careful rotation, mending them himself rather than buying new ones. Money had never been the thing Daniel measured his days by, not before the war and certainly not after it, and the people who knew him best understood that this was not modesty performed for effect, but simply the shape of the man underneath. There was a version of Daniel that existed only in memory now. The version who had once come home from 2 overseas deployments, to a wife who waited on the porch every evening, no matter the weather, who had built a life with her slowly and carefully, plank by plank, the same way he built everything else. Her name had been Sarah, and the illness that took her had moved slowly enough that he'd had time to prepare, and fast enough that no amount of preparation had made the loss any easier to carry. In the 6 years since, Daniel had rebuilt himself into someone smaller in some ways, and steadier in others, a man who poured whatever tenderness he still carried into strangers and neighbors because there was no longer a wife waiting to receive it. He did not speak of grief, because grief, in his experience, was not something spoken so much as something worked through with your hands, one repaired faucet, and one rewired outlet at a time. That particular evening, after 12 straight hours spent repairing a burst pipe in an old apartment building, he decided he deserved something better than a sandwich eaten standing at his kitchen counter. He walked into the restaurant, with rain still clinging to his shoulders, took a table near the window, and ordered the simplest thing on the menu, content to eat in peace and disappear back into his ordinary life once the plate was empty. He had no interest in the wealth surrounding him, no interest in being seen. He simply wanted 1 hour of quiet before returning to a house that had felt too silent for 6 long years. It was in that hour, halfway through his meal, that he first heard the raised voice from the far side of the room, harsh and demanding, cutting straight through the soft clatter of silverware and low conversation. The man causing the disturbance was Richard Vaughn, 48 years old, a real estate developer whose name appeared on half the glass towers lining the waterfront. Richard had built his fortune on aggressive deals and even more aggressive charm, and he had long ago learned that money bought him more than comfort. It bought him an audience willing to laugh at whatever he said, and a kind of permission, in his own mind, to treat the people who served him as though they existed only for his convenience. That night he had brought 3 friends to celebrate a contract closing, and from the moment they sat down, he made a show of demanding attention from every server who passed his table. He complained the wine was too warm, then too cold. He complained the appetizer arrived 4 minutes later than he expected. He seemed to be searching for something, anything, that would let him perform his displeasure in front of an audience, and eventually his search landed on the woman assigned to his section. Her name was Emily Carter, 29 years old, soft-spoken, careful in her movements, the kind of waitress who remembered regulars' orders without needing to ask twice. She had been serving Richard's table for nearly 40 minutes, absorbing his complaints with practiced patience, apologizing for things that were never her fault, refilling glasses that were barely touched before being called empty again. When she set down the second bottle of wine, Richard reached out and deliberately knocked it, sending dark red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth and onto the floor near her shoes. He laughed, loud and performative, turning to his friends as though this were the funniest thing he had witnessed all week. Then he told Emily that her clumsiness had ruined his evening, and that she owed him an apology in front of everyone at the table. Emily apologized quietly, kneeling to clean the mess, her hands steady even though her voice was not. Richard was not satisfied. He pulled a folded stack of cash from his jacket, peeled off several bills, and instead of handing them to her, he tore them slowly in front of her face, letting the pieces fall onto the wet tablecloth like confetti, telling her that this was what her service was worth to him. The restaurant had gone quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when everyone is watching, but nobody wants to be the one who steps forward. Other diners glanced up, exchanged uneasy looks, and then returned their eyes to their plates, unwilling to involve themselves in a wealthy man's tantrum. A young couple near the bar quietly asked for their check early, deciding it was safer to leave than to witness whatever came next. An older gentleman 2 tables over lowered his newspaper just enough to watch, then raised it again, choosing the comfort of not knowing over the discomfort of intervening. The restaurant manager hovered near the kitchen doorway, wringing his hands, painfully aware that Richard Vaughn was one of the establishment's most valuable regular clients and terrified of losing that account over a moment of conflict. When Emily tried to stand and return to the kitchen, Richard reached out and closed his hand around her wrist, gripping hard enough that she winced, pulling her back down toward the empty chair beside him and insisting that she sit and keep him company since, in his words, she clearly had nothing better to do than embarrass herself. Emily's face went pale, her breath caught, and for the first time since the encounter began, real fear flickered behind her composed expression. She glanced desperately around the room, searching for anyone willing to intervene, and found only lowered eyes and averted faces, an entire dining room, choosing comfort over courage. It was at that exact moment that Daniel Brooks set down his fork. He did not rush. He did not shout. He rose from his chair with the same unhurried calm he might use to check a water heater, folded his napkin, and crossed the dining room with steady, even steps that somehow drew every eye in the restaurant despite making almost no sound at all. When he reached Richard's table, he did not raise his voice. He simply looked down at the hand still wrapped around Emily's wrist and said, in a low-level tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could, that it was time to let go of her arm. Richard turned, startled by the interruption, and looked Daniel up and down with open contempt, taking in the plain jacket, the work-worn hands, the absence of any visible wealth, and decided immediately that this stranger was beneath his notice. He asked, with a sneer curling his lip, exactly who this man thought he was to interrupt a private conversation. Daniel answered simply that he was a man who did not like watching a woman get treated that way, and that Richard should release her wrist now. While things were still easy between them, Richard laughed, the sound sharp and cruel, and turned back to his friends to share the joke, calling Daniel an old man playing hero, a washed-up soldier who probably fixed toilets for a living and had wandered into a restaurant meant for people who actually mattered. His friends laughed along on cue, one of them mockingly asking if Daniel was going to arrest them, another suggesting someone call for a real manager instead of a plumber. Daniel did not flinch, did not raise his voice, did not offer them the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply repeated, in the same unwavering tone, that Richard needed to let go of her wrist. Something about that stillness unsettled Richard more than shouting would have. Rich men were used to being challenged by other rich men, in boardrooms, at dinner parties, through lawyers and lawsuits. But they were rarely challenged this directly, this plainly, by someone who clearly had nothing to lose and nothing to prove. Furious at being defied in front of his friends, Richard released Emily's wrist and shoved himself up from his chair, closing the distance to Daniel, with the exaggerated aggression of a man who had never actually been in a real fight in his life. He shoved Daniel's shoulder hard, expecting the older man to stumble backward, expecting the satisfaction of watching him fall in front of the entire restaurant. Daniel simply shifted his weight a few inches, an almost imperceptible movement built from years of training. And Richard's own momentum betrayed him, sending him stumbling sideways into an empty chair, arms flailing, before he caught himself against the edge of the table. The dining room, which had been holding its collective breath, let out a wave of muffled gasps and whispers. And for one long, humiliating moment, Richard Vaughn stood frozen, red-faced, realizing that he had just made himself look foolish in front of everyone whose opinion he cared about most. Richard's humiliation curdled instantly into rage. He straightened his jacket, jabbed a finger toward Daniel, and announced loudly that he was calling the police, that this man had just assaulted him, that everyone in the restaurant had witnessed an unprovoked attack from a stranger, with clear, violent tendencies. He turned toward the manager and demanded that security cameras be reviewed immediately to prove his version of events, certain that his wealth and his connections would bend the story in his favor, no matter what the footage actually showed. The manager, caught between two impossible outcomes, nervously agreed to pull the recordings, his hands trembling as he tried to calculate which choice would cost the restaurant less money in the long run. What Richard did not anticipate was Emily stepping forward, still shaken but resolute, insisting to the manager and to the small crowd gathering nearby that Daniel had done nothing wrong, that he had only tried to protect her, that Richard had grabbed her wrist and refused to let go until this stranger intervened on her behalf. Richard, sensing the room's sympathy shifting away from him, escalated his threats further, warning the manager that he had the connections and the resources to have this restaurant's reputation destroyed within a month if his demands were not met, that a single phone call from him could close these doors permanently. The manager's composure cracked visibly under the weight of that threat, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire situation might tip in Richard's favor, simply because his money spoke louder than the truth. Daniel, never one to seek out conflict for its own sake, quietly gathered his coat and prepared to leave rather than let an innocent business suffer because of his involvement, believing that his part in the evening was finished and that walking away was the responsible thing to do. Before he reached the door, Emily caught up to him, her voice quiet but steady, and thanked him for what he had done, telling him that in 6 months of working there, no one had ever stepped in for her the way he just had. Their eyes met for a brief moment, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of two people who had both learned, in very different ways, what it felt like to be underestimated and overlooked by a world that valued the wrong things. What no one in that restaurant knew, what Daniel himself had no way of knowing, was that the young woman he had just defended was not simply a waitress struggling to make rent. Emily Carter was the only child of William Carter, a man whose name appeared on the boards of banks, shipping companies, and technology firms across 3 continents, a fortune built over 4 decades that had made the Carter family one of the wealthiest and most private in the entire country. Emily had grown up behind gated properties and tinted car windows, educated by private tutors, flown across oceans for family vacations most people only saw in magazines, and yet none of it had ever felt entirely real to her. She had spent her early 20s watching executives and socialites treat her with exaggerated warmth the moment they learned her last name, and she had come to distrust every smile that arrived only after that recognition. When she turned 28, she made a decision that shocked her father's entire inner circle. She asked for 6 months away from the family name, away from the assistants and the security detail, to work an ordinary job under a different surname, and discover, for the first time in her life, how people treated her when they believed she had nothing to offer them. William Carter, 65 years old and quietly regarded as one of the sharpest minds in modern business, had not resisted his daughter's request the way most fathers in his position might have. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the danger of building a life entirely inside a bubble of privilege, having watched too many wealthy families raise heirs who could not survive a single day without an assistant managing their schedule. He had built his own fortune from far humbler beginnings than most people assumed, starting with a small shipping contract decades earlier and expanding it, deal by careful deal, into an empire that now touched banking, technology, and logistics across 3 continents. And he had never forgotten the discomfort of being underestimated in his own early years. That memory was part of why he agreed to let Emily disappear into ordinary life on one condition: that she allow a small, discreet security team to monitor her from a distance, invisible but present, ready to intervene only if her safety was ever genuinely threatened. What William did not tell her was that he intended to use this period not only as a test of her independence, but as a quiet evaluation of her character, watching from afar to see how she handled hardship, disrespect, and the kind of ordinary struggle that no inheritance could shield a person from. He received reports weekly, sometimes daily, thin folders delivered to his study by a single trusted aide, and he had grown steadily prouder of the woman his daughter was becoming, someone who worked double shifts without complaint, who remembered her coworkers' birthdays, who treated the elderly regulars at the restaurant with the same warmth as anyone else. Emily herself had chosen the name Carter, deliberately, half hidden in plain sight, reasoning that no one searching for a billionaire's daughter would ever expect her to use even a shortened version of her real surname while scrubbing down tables for minimum wage and modest tips. She rented a small apartment above a laundromat 3 streets from the restaurant, furnished with second-hand furniture she had picked out herself for the first time in her life. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she slept better in that cramped apartment than she ever had in the east wing of her father's estate. She had grown tired, long before this experiment began, of dinner parties where every laugh felt rehearsed and every compliment carried a hidden request behind it, and the ordinary exhaustion of an honest day's work felt, strangely, like relief. The night Richard Vaughn grabbed his daughter's wrist, William Carter received the call within the hour. His security team, positioned unseen throughout the restaurant, had witnessed the entire confrontation, and their report described in careful detail how a stranger in a plain gray jacket had stepped forward when every other person in that room chose comfortable silence instead. William read the report twice in his study that night. The fire in the hearth throwing long shadows across the room, and when he finished, he set the paper down and said quietly to himself that the time for watching from a distance had finally passed. He picked up his phone and made a single call to his head of security, instructing him to arrange a visit to the restaurant the following evening. No announcement, no fanfare, nothing that would draw attention before he was ready for it to be drawn. William Carter arrived the next evening, dressed in an unremarkable wool coat, carrying no entourage, no visible wealth, nothing that distinguished him from any other older gentleman choosing a quiet dinner alone. The restaurant staff seated him without recognition, and he spent the first 20 minutes simply observing, asking gentle, unhurried questions of the young server who brought his water, learning without pressing too hard that the strange confrontation from the previous night was still the only thing anyone in the building could talk about. He asked to see the security footage under the pretense of concern for the restaurant's safety. And the manager, eager to please any guest, willing to show interest rather than complaint, allowed him a private viewing in the back office. William watched the recording twice, studying Daniel's calm posture, the way he never raised his hands in aggression. The way his entire focus stayed fixed on Emily's safety, rather than on winning a confrontation. He watched Richard Vaughn sneer and posture and threaten, and he watched his own daughter's fear dissolve the moment a stranger chose to stand beside her instead of walking past. Richard happened to be dining at the same restaurant again that evening, drawn back partly out of stubborn pride, determined to prove to his friends and to himself that the previous night's humiliation had been a fluke rather than a genuine defeat. When he noticed the older gentleman in the wool coat asking quiet questions near the bar, he assumed, based on nothing but his own arrogance, that this must be some retired accountant or minor property manager, someone entirely unworthy of his attention. He made a passing comment loud enough to be overheard, joking that the neighborhood had really gone downhill if this was the caliber of clientele the restaurant now attracted. William said nothing in response, simply offered a small, unreadable smile. The kind of smile that men who have negotiated billion-dollar mergers learn to wear when lesser opponents underestimate them. He excused himself politely, stepped outside into the cold evening air, and made a single phone call. Within 20 minutes, more than 10 black luxury vehicles arrived outside the restaurant in a slow, deliberate procession, filling the narrow street with a silence that felt heavier than any siren could have produced. Drivers stepped out first, followed by a small team of sharply dressed assistants and security personnel, and the restaurant staff, watching through the windows, began to whisper among themselves with rising unease, none of them yet understanding what was happening or why. Richard, still seated at his table with his friends, glanced toward the window and felt the first genuine flicker of nervousness pass through him, though his pride refused to let him acknowledge it out loud. He told his friends it was probably nothing, some minor celebrity or corporate event unrelated to their evening, and forced himself to return to his meal even as his hands betrayed a slight, involuntary tremor around his wine glass. William Carter walked back inside, and this time the manager, sensing something had fundamentally shifted, hurried over with an entirely different posture than he had shown either Richard or Daniel the night before. William asked, calmly and clearly, for Emily to be brought out from the kitchen, and when she appeared, still in her uniform, confusion written plainly across her face at the sight of her father standing in the middle of her workplace, surrounded by an unmistakable show of power, she froze in place. William crossed the room to her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and turned to address the stunned dining room, his voice calm, but carrying easily across the silent space. He introduced Emily not as a waitress, not as an ordinary young woman working an ordinary job, but as his only daughter, the heir to the Carter family fortune, the future leader of a corporation whose holdings touched nearly every industry represented by the wealthy diners currently sitting frozen in their chairs. The reaction rippled through the restaurant like a physical wave. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. The manager's face drained of color as he mentally replayed every small kindness and every small failure he had shown Emily over the past 6 months, suddenly terrified of what consequences might follow. Richard Vaughn, who had spent the previous evening humiliating a waitress he believed powerless and inconsequential, felt the blood leave his face entirely as the true weight of his mistake settled over him. He rose from his seat so quickly, his chair nearly toppled backward, stammering apologies that tripped over each other, insisting he had never meant any disrespect, that it had all been a simple misunderstanding, that surely they could discuss this like reasonable people. Emily looked at him with an expression that held no satisfaction, no desire for revenge, only quiet disappointment, and she told him plainly that an apology offered only after learning her last name was not an apology at all, but simply fear of consequences. William Carter turned then, not toward Richard, but toward the room at large, and asked a single question that seemed to hang in the silence far longer than its length should have allowed. He asked what might have happened to his daughter that night if she truly had been nothing more than an ordinary waitress, with no wealthy father waiting to intervene, if there had been no security team watching from the shadows, no phone call capable of summoning 10 luxury vehicles within minutes. Nobody in the room offered an answer, because everyone understood, in that uncomfortable silence, exactly what the honest answer would have been. Daniel, who had arrived that evening for what he assumed would be another quiet dinner, and had instead walked into the unfolding revelation, stood near the back of the room in stunned silence of his own, realizing for the first time that the young woman he had defended the previous night carried a name that could reshape entire industries with a single signature. He had not known. He had never asked. He had simply seen someone in trouble and done what he believed anyone should do, and the discovery of who she truly was changed nothing about the choice he had already made. Later that evening, after Richard and his friends had been quietly asked to leave, and the restaurant had slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, William Carter approached Daniel directly and asked for a few minutes of his time. They sat together near a corner table, away from curious eyes, and William thanked him with a sincerity that carried none of the performative gratitude Daniel had grown used to encountering from people trying to impress him. He asked Daniel simple questions first, about his service, about how long he had lived in the city, about the work he did now, listening carefully to each answer, the way a man listens when he is genuinely trying to understand someone rather than simply filling silence. William offered, without hesitation, a substantial sum of money as a reward for his courage, along with the keys to a new vehicle, an offer to cover a full year of housing expenses, and even a standing position managing property maintenance across the Carter family's extensive real estate holdings. A role that would have paid Daniel more in a single year than he typically earned in 5. Daniel listened patiently, turning his water glass slowly between his fingers, then shook his head and declined every offer, one after another, with the same quiet firmness he had shown Richard the night before. He explained that he had not stepped forward hoping for a reward, that he had simply done what any decent person should have done, and that accepting payment for it would somehow cheapen the only thing that had actually mattered to him in that moment, which was making sure Emily was safe. William studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies something rare he has not encountered in many years, and something in his expression shifted from gratitude into genuine respect. He told Daniel that in 4 decades of building his fortune, he had met countless men eager to accept money for far less, executives who would sell their own integrity for a fraction of what he had just offered without a second thought, and that a man who refused it entirely was a far rarer thing than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. He said, half to himself, that he understood now why his daughter had spoken of this stranger with such quiet warmth in the brief moments before he arrived, and he found himself, unexpectedly, hoping this would not be the last conversation the two of them shared. Emily, standing nearby, listened to the exchange with an expression that had softened considerably since the fear and tension of the previous night. And when her father finally stepped away to handle a phone call, she sat down across from Daniel and asked, simply, if he would be willing to talk with her for a while. Not as a rescuer and a victim, but as two people who had genuinely enjoyed the brief conversation they'd shared before everything became complicated. Daniel, who had not laughed freely in longer than he could easily remember, found himself smiling at something she said within the first few minutes. A small, unguarded sound that surprised even him. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of that night rippled outward in ways nobody at the restaurant could have predicted. Richard Vaughn's carefully constructed reputation began to unravel, not through any act of revenge orchestrated by Emily or her father, but through the simple momentum of truth finally catching up with old behavior. Once word spread of what had happened, other employees, contractors, and business partners who had endured Richard's arrogance in silence for years began coming forward with their own accounts, emboldened by the knowledge that his cruelty had finally been witnessed by someone with the power to hold him accountable. A former assistant described years of being screamed at over minor scheduling errors. A contractor recalled an unpaid invoice Richard had refused to settle out of pure spite after a minor disagreement. None of these stories were new, exactly, but for the first time they found an audience willing to listen rather than look away. Investors grew nervous. A major contract Richard had been counting on collapsed within a month, as the partner company quietly withdrew, citing concerns about reputational risk. His board of directors, sensing the shifting winds, launched an internal investigation into his conduct, poring over old emails and expense reports that revealed a pattern far uglier than a single bad evening at a restaurant. Several long-standing business relationships he had relied on for years began distancing themselves one by one, until Richard found himself making phone calls that used to be answered within minutes and now went unreturned for days. It was not a single dramatic downfall, but a slow, cumulative unraveling, each thread pulling loose, because the truth of who he really was could no longer be hidden behind expensive suits and confident smiles. He tried, more than once, to reach Emily directly, hoping a private apology and perhaps a donation to some charity of her choosing might repair the damage. But she never returned his calls, and eventually he stopped trying, retreating instead into a smaller and increasingly bitter version of the life he had once taken for granted. Daniel, for his part, returned to his ordinary life largely unchanged on the surface, still waking before sunrise, still repairing pipes and rewiring outdated electrical panels across the city, still living in the same modest house that had felt too quiet for 6 long years. But something inside him had shifted, some door that had been closed since his wife's death creaking open just slightly wider than before. Emily began stopping by his workshop every so often, first with a simple excuse about a flickering light in her temporary apartment, then later with no excuse at all, simply because she wanted to see him. She would sit on an overturned crate near his workbench while he finished repairs on some neighbor's broken appliance, asking him questions about his old unit, about the tools scattered across the bench, about the small carved wooden bird he kept on the windowsill that he eventually admitted his late wife had bought him on their honeymoon. He answered slowly, carefully, the way a man speaks when he has not practiced conversation like this in years, and she never pushed him further than he was ready to go. They talked easily, about nothing important and everything important at once, about the ocean and old books and the strange quiet of houses that once held more people than they did now. Word spread slowly through Daniel's small circle of neighbors and clients that he had somehow befriended the Carter heiress, and though a few teased him gently about it, most simply noticed the change in him, the way he seemed to stand a little straighter, the way his rare laughter had started coming more easily. Emily, for her own part, found herself looking forward to those evenings more than she looked forward to almost anything else in her carefully managed life. A small, ordinary garage, lit by a single hanging bulb, becoming the one place in the world where nobody wanted anything from her, except her company. William Carter watched this quiet friendship develop from a respectful distance, the same patient distance he had maintained throughout his daughter's entire 6 months of anonymity, and he found himself increasingly satisfied with what he observed. He had spent decades surrounded by people who valued him only for what he could provide, and watching his daughter build something with a man who had refused every material reward offered to him felt, to William, like proof that decency still existed in a world he sometimes feared had forgotten how to recognize it. He began making inquiries of his own, quiet and unofficial, into Daniel's military service, his years of steady, honest work, the countless small kindnesses his neighbors described when asked, and every answer only deepened William's growing respect for the man his daughter had chosen to spend her evenings with. He said nothing of this to Emily directly, content to let the relationship develop on its own terms, but privately, he began planning something he had not attempted in many years. A public acknowledgement, not of his own success, but of a stranger's quiet integrity. Several months later, William Carter organized a formal gathering at the family estate, an event that drew hundreds of the region's most prominent business leaders, investors, and civic figures, ostensibly to celebrate the corporation's latest quarterly achievements. Daniel received an invitation that arrived by courier, embossed and formal in a way that felt almost absurd against the backdrop of his usual mail of overdue bills and hardware store flyers, and he very nearly declined before Emily convinced him, gently but firmly, that his presence mattered more than he understood. He spent an uncomfortable afternoon at a tailor's shop Emily had recommended, standing awkwardly on a small platform while a patient old tailor pinned the sleeves of a dark suit he would never have chosen for himself, and he caught himself wondering more than once whether he even belonged in a room full of people who measured their worth in numbers he could not fully imagine. He arrived that evening in that simple dark suit, feeling entirely out of place among the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, standing quietly near the edges of the grand hall, while unfamiliar faces exchanged pleasantries and business cards around him. Emily found him almost immediately, looping her arm through his with an easy familiarity that had grown between them over the preceding months, and stayed close by his side as the evening's formal program began. When William Carter stepped up to address the assembled crowd, the room fell into the kind of immediate, respectful silence that only decades of earned authority could produce. He spoke first about the corporation's growth, about new initiatives and expanding markets, the kind of remarks the crowd had come expecting to hear. Then, without warning, his tone shifted, growing quieter, more personal. And he began telling a story about a rainy autumn evening several months earlier, about a wealthy man who had mistaken cruelty for power, and about a stranger in a plain gray jacket who had stood up when no one else in a crowded room found the courage to move. He described, in careful detail, how that stranger had asked for nothing in return, had refused every reward offered to him, and had simply walked away believing he had done nothing more than what any decent person should do. He spoke of watching his own daughter grow into someone capable of leading an empire, not because of the name she carried, but because of the quiet character she had built for herself in a small apartment above a laundromat, scrubbing tables and counting tips like anyone else. William paused, searched the crowd until he found Daniel standing near the back, and said, with a clarity that carried to every corner of the silent hall, that the truest measure of wealth in that restaurant on that particular night had not belonged to him or to anyone else seated comfortably at their tables, but to the one man in the room willing to risk everything he had for someone he had never met before. The room rose to its feet almost as one, applause rolling through the grand hall in a wave that left Daniel visibly startled, his hands tightening involuntarily at his sides, as decades of learned humility fought against the unfamiliar weight of public recognition. He looked down at the floor for a moment, jaw tight, and Emily squeezed his arm gently, steadying him, her eyes bright with something that looked very much like pride. Later that same evening, William made a second announcement, this one concerning the future of the corporation itself, formally naming Emily as his successor, the next leader of an empire that touched nearly every corner of the global economy. A decision, he explained, had been shaped in no small part by watching how his daughter carried herself during her months away from privilege, how she treated people when she believed no one of consequence was watching. Emily accepted the announcement with quiet grace, thanking her father, thanking the room, and then, in a small gesture that went unnoticed by most of the crowd, but not by Daniel, she found his eyes across the room and held his gaze for a long, steady moment before returning her attention to the guests still offering their congratulations. After the formal program ended, and the crowd slowly dispersed into smaller conversations scattered across the estate's many rooms, Emily found Daniel again, near a quiet terrace, overlooking the dark, rain-slicked gardens below. She asked if he would like to get coffee with her sometime soon, somewhere ordinary, somewhere far removed from chandeliers and formal introductions, and made clear, gently but unmistakably, that this invitation had nothing to do with gratitude or obligation. She told him that in the month since that rainy night at the restaurant, she had come to understand something about him that no amount of wealth or status could replicate, a steadiness, a quiet decency that asked for nothing and expected nothing, the kind of character she had spent her entire adult life searching for without knowing exactly what she was looking for. Daniel, standing beside her on that quiet terrace with the city lights blurring softly through the rain below them, felt something loosen in his chest that had been tightly wound since the day he buried his wife, and he told her, honestly, that he would like that very much. In the months that followed, Richard Vaughn's business empire continued its slow collapse, undone entirely by the accumulated weight of his own past behavior, rather than by any deliberate act of revenge, a lesson he would spend years trying and failing to fully absorb. William Carter stepped back gradually from daily operations, watching with quiet satisfaction as his daughter guided the corporation with a steady hand shaped by lessons no boardroom could have taught her. Daniel kept his small handyman business running, still waking early, still working with his hands, still refusing every offer that came his way to trade his simple life for something grander, though now his evenings were rarely spent in silence anymore. What had begun as a single moment of courage in a rain-soaked restaurant, one man refusing to look away while a stranger suffered in front of an indifferent crowd, had grown into something none of them could have predicted that night. A public reckoning for cruelty, a father's renewed faith in the future of everything he had built, and for a quiet widower who had long ago stopped expecting anything good to find him again, a second chance at a life built not on money or recognition, but on the simple, enduring value of doing right by another person when it would have been far easier to do nothing at all.